There are moments in history when a nation stands at the edge of everything it has ever dreamed of, when the maps are being redrawn and the diplomats are talking, and the thing that generations of people have sacrificed for is finally, actually, within reach. Greece stood at that edge in 1919, not metaphorically, not as a distant possibility that historians would later describe as theoretically achievable under different circumstances. Actually, concretely, with documents signed and borders agreed, and the support of the most powerful nations on earth, committed in writing to a Greek future that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had lived through the previous century of struggle. The Megali idea, the great idea, the dream that had animated Greek politics and Greek identity since the founding of the modern Greek state in the 1820s. The reunification of all Greek populations of the Eastern Mediterranean under a single Greek state. Constantinople, Anatolia, the coastlines and islands and cities where Greeks had been living since before the word Europe existed. In 1919, after 4 years of the most destructive war in human history, that dream was closer to reality than it had ever been. One man had put it there. One man had spent 4 years navigating the most complex diplomatic environment in modern history, playing great powers against each other, building alliances, calling in favors, making promises he could keep, and extracting commitments from men who rarely made them. One man had walked into the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 as the representative of a small Balkan nation and walked out having negotiated territorial gains that would nearly double the size of his country and place Greece on the threshold of its greatest historical ambition. His name was Eleftherios Venizelos, and in November 1920, the Greek people voted him out of office. What happened in the 18 months between the greatest Greek diplomatic triumph in modern history and the election that threw it away is one of the most devastating stories in the political history of any nation. It is a story about the gap between what a people's leaders can achieve and what a people are willing to sustain, about the cost of vision when the people who need to share it are exhausted, about how the greatest victories in history can be undone not by superior enemies, but by the ordinary mechanisms of democratic politics operating on a population that has been at war for too long. It is a story that ends with 1.5 million Greeks expelled from their homes, with Smyrna burning, with the dream of Constantinople receding forever. It begins with a man from Crete who understood what Greece could become and spent his life trying to make it real. Eleftherios Venizelos was born on August 23, 1864, in the village of Smyrna in Crete, an island that was still part of the Ottoman Empire at the time of his birth and would not become part of Greece until 1913. He was born into a family with a tradition of resistance to Ottoman rule, into a community that understood what it meant to fight for something larger than individual survival, into a political culture where the question of Greek identity and Greek freedom was not abstract, but immediate and personal. He trained as a lawyer. He became a politician. He became the dominant political figure of Crete's struggle for union with Greece. And in 1910, at the invitation of the Greek military officers who had staged a coup demanding political reform, he came to Athens and took over the government of a country that was, by any objective measure, a minor Balkan state with approximately 5.5 million people, significant internal divisions, and no obvious path to the great historical destiny that its educated classes insisted was its birthright. He transformed it. In 2 years, 1910 to 1912, Venizelos reorganized the Greek army with French military assistance, reformed the state administration, modernized the tax system, and rebuilt the political institutions of a country that had been lurching between crisis and stagnation for decades. He did all of this while simultaneously building the diplomatic relationships with Serbia and Bulgaria that would become the Balkan League, the alliance that would fight the First Balkan War of 1912. The results of that war, covered in previous videos on this channel, doubled the size of Greece, Thessaloniki, most of Macedonia, Epirus, the Aegean Islands, achieved in 6 weeks of fighting that the Ottoman military establishment had not believed was possible against the Greek army it had dismissed since 1897. Venizelos had built the army that won those battles. Venizelos had built the alliance that made them possible. And Venizelos understood, with the clarity of a man who had been reading the map of Greek ambitions since childhood, that what had been achieved in 1912 and 1913 was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the last chapter. The last chapter required one more thing. It required Greece to be on the right side of the war, that everyone who was paying attention could see coming. By 1914, the European alliance system is cracking in ways that will produce the First World War. Venizelos, watching from Athens, makes a strategic calculation that defines the next 6 years of Greek history. Greece must enter the war on the Allied side, on the side of Britain, France, and Russia. Not because the Allies are necessarily going to win, though Venizelos believes they will, but because the Allies control the seas around Greece, because Greek territorial ambitions in Anatolia and Thrace can only be satisfied with Allied support, and because the alternative, neutrality or alignment with Germany and Austria-Hungary, leads to a Greek future that is smaller, not larger, than the present. This calculation is correct. It is also deeply unpopular with one specific and enormously consequential person, King Constantine I of Greece. Constantine is not a fool. He is not a German puppet in the simple way that his opponents and Allied propaganda sometimes suggest. He is a Greek king who has his own strategic calculation that Germany is going to win the war, that Greek neutrality is the safest path through a European conflict that Greece has no business entering, and that the territorial promises the Allies are making to Venizelos in exchange for Greek participation are promises that the Allies will not keep once the war is over. He is wrong about Germany winning. He is not entirely wrong about Allied promises. The history of great power commitments to small nations in the early 20th century gives him reasonable grounds for skepticism. But he is the king. And in the Greek constitutional system of 1914, the king has the power to dismiss the prime minister, which is what he does repeatedly when Venizelos tries to bring Greece into the war on the Allied side. The result is the national schism, the ethnikos dikasmos, the division of Greece into two camps that defines Greek political life for decades. On one side, the Venizelists, the liberal, modernizing, expansionist camp that sees the Allied cause as Greece's path to greatness. On the other side, the Royalists, the conservative camp that follows the king into neutrality and sees Venizelos's ambitions as reckless adventurism that will destroy Greece rather than expand it. The schism runs through every Greek institution, through the army, which splits between officers loyal to Venizelos and officers loyal to the king, through the church, through the press, through families, in the way that the deepest political divisions always eventually reach. It is a wound in the body of the Greek state that the victories of 1912 and 1913 had temporarily obscured, and that the war has torn fully open. In 1916, Venizelos, unable to bring the Athens government to his position, establishes a rival government in Thessaloniki, the city his army had liberated in 1912, and begins operating as a parallel administration in northern Greece with Allied support. Greece is, for a period, effectively two countries, the royalist government in Athens maintaining neutrality, the Venizelist government in Thessaloniki moving toward active participation in the Allied cause. In June 1917, Allied pressure forces King Constantine to abdicate. His second son Alexander takes the throne, a young man with no political agenda of his own, who will reign as a constitutional monarch while Venizelos runs the government. Greece officially enters the war on the Allied side. The Greek army begins fighting on the Macedonian front alongside British, French, and Serbian forces. The Greek divisions that enter the war in 1917 are among the most experienced military formations in Europe, veterans of the Balkan Wars and the guerrilla campaigns of Macedonia, hardened by years of conflict that have given them a professional quality that their Allied partners quickly learn to respect. They fight on the Macedonian front through 1917 and 1918 with the quality that Turkish after-action reports from that period document with professional honesty, cohesive, aggressive, animated by a motivation that goes deeper than military orders. The war ends on November 11th, 1918. The Allied powers have won. The Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, are defeated and being dismembered at the peace conference already being organized in Paris. Venizelos goes to Paris. January 1919. The Paris Peace Conference. The men gathered in Paris are deciding the shape of the world that comes after the most destructive war in history. Empires are being dissolved. New states are being created. Populations are being assigned to nations based on a combination of ethnographic data, strategic calculation, great power interest, and the personal impressions that national delegations make on the men doing the assigning. Venizelos is extraordinary at this. He presents the Greek case to the Supreme Council, the body of Allied leaders making the key decisions, with a command of detail, a clarity of argument, and a personal persuasiveness that delegates from much larger and more powerful nations struggle to match. He presents demographic data on Greek populations in disputed territories. He presents historical arguments for Greek claims that go back to antiquity. He presents strategic arguments about the role a larger Greece could play in the Eastern Mediterranean as a stable, pro-Western state in a region that is going to be volatile for decades. He presents all of this in fluent French and English, without notes, responding to challenges and questions with the precision of a man who has spent years preparing for exactly this moment. David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, describes Venizelos as one of the greatest statesmen of the age. This is not flattery. It is the assessment of a man who has sat across negotiating tables from most of the major political figures of the era and knows the difference between a skilled politician and a genuine strategic mind. The results are extraordinary. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed on August 10th, 1920, gives Greece Eastern Thrace, the European territory of the Ottoman Empire, up to a line just outside Constantinople. Not Constantinople itself, that remains under a special international regime, but everything else. The territory that puts Greek soldiers and Greek administration within striking distance of the city that Greeks have called simply the city since 1453. The Smyrna zone, a large area of western Anatolia around the city of Smyrna, placed under Greek administration for 5 years, after which a plebiscite will determine its final status. Given the Greek majority population of the region, the plebiscite is expected to result in formal annexation to Greece. The Aegean Islands confirmed under Greek sovereignty. Think about what this means. Think about what a Greek child born in 1919 would grow up in if this treaty were implemented. A Greece that includes most of Thrace, a Greece with a zone of administration in Anatolia that is expected to become permanent. A Greece positioned, for the first time since the Byzantine Empire, as a significant power in the Eastern Mediterranean rather than a minor Balkan state. The Megali idea, which had seemed like romantic nationalism when the modern Greek state was founded in the 1820s, is being written into the peace settlement of the First World War. Constantinople was within reach. For the first time since 1453, since the Ottoman conquest that ended the Byzantine Empire and changed the Eastern Mediterranean forever, the city that Greeks call simply the city was within the diplomatic grasp of the Greek state. Venizelos has done this. One man, working the conference rooms and the private dinners and the informal conversations that are where the real decisions at any major diplomatic gathering are actually made, has extracted from the most powerful nations on earth a commitment to a Greek future that no Greek leader before him had been able to secure. He returns to Greece as a hero. The newspapers call him the greatest Greek since Pericles. He is at the peak of his power and his achievement. He calls elections for November 1920. He expects to win. Everyone who is paying attention to Greek politics expects him to win. The Allies expect him to win. The foreign press covering Greece expects him to win. What nobody fully accounts for is the exhaustion. Greece has been at war since 1912. 8 years. A full generation of men has spent their adult lives in uniform. In the Balkan Wars, in the First World War, in the ongoing military operations in Anatolia that the Smyrna landing of 1919 has initiated. The families of those men have been sending them off and waiting for them and receiving news about them for 8 years. The Greek economy, never robust, has been strained by 8 years of military expenditure. The internal divisions of the national schism have created a political atmosphere of bitterness and suspicion that makes rational calculation about national interest difficult. And then, in October 1920, something happens that Venizelos cannot control and cannot respond to effectively. King Alexander, the young king who has been reigning as a constitutional monarch while Venizelos governs, is bitten by a pet monkey while walking in the royal gardens. The bite becomes infected. On October 25, 1920, at the age of 27, King Alexander dies. The death of Alexander creates a constitutional crisis. The question of who should be king becomes immediately and urgently political. The royalist opposition seizes it. The question is put to the Greek people. Should King Constantine, who abdicated under Allied pressure in 1917, be allowed to return? Venizelos makes a mistake. He allows the election and the monarchy question to become entangled, to be fought simultaneously rather than separately. The royalists campaign on both issues at once, and the exhaustion of 8 years of war gives their message about Constantine's return, their promise of peace and normalcy and an end to Venizelos's endless ambitions. A resonance that the objective assessment of the diplomatic situation does not justify. On November 14, 1920, Greece votes. Venizelos loses, not narrowly, decisively. The royalist opposition wins a majority that reflects not just a preference for Constantine over Venizelos, but a profound exhaustion with everything that Venizelos represents: the ambition, the sacrifice, the endless war. the vision of a greater Greece that requires a generation to keep fighting for it. The greatest Greek statesman of the modern era, at the moment of his greatest achievement, is voted out of office by the people he has spent his career trying to serve. He leaves Greece the next day. He boards a ship and goes into exile, carrying with him the knowledge of what he has built and what is about to happen to it. Because he knows, he understands the diplomatic reality with perfect clarity. He knows that the return of Constantine, the king whose pro-German neutrality during the war the Allies have not forgotten and will not forgive, will destroy the Allied support that the entire Anatolian project depends on. He knows that without British backing and French supplies and American diplomatic cover, the Greek army in Anatolia is an army fighting a war it cannot sustain against an enemy that is growing stronger every month. He knows that everything he built in Paris is about to be dismantled, not by the Turks, not by the great powers, by a vote. In a plebiscite held on December 5, 1920, the Greek people vote for the return of Constantine by an enormous majority. He returns to Athens on December 19, 1920. The Allied reaction is immediate. Britain withdraws financial support for the Greek military operations in Anatolia. France begins negotiating separately with Kemal's nationalist government, eventually supplying it with weapons and advisors. Italy follows suit. The diplomatic architecture that Venizelos spent years constructing collapses in weeks. In Ankara, Mustafa Kemal reads the election results and understands what they mean. The Greek army in Anatolia has just lost its strategic foundation. It is now an army fighting without Allied support, without Allied supplies, without Allied diplomatic cover, in terrain that favors the defender, against a nationalist movement that is growing stronger and more organized every month. He has time. He will use it. Everything in this video is documented. Real names, real dates, real decisions made by real people that change the lives of 1.5 million Greeks forever. That documentation exists, but without someone telling the story, it dies in an archive. Your subscription keeps that from happening. And if this story deserved to be told, that like button is how you say so. The consequences of November 1920 unfolded with a logic that Venizelos had predicted, and that everyone who understood the diplomatic situation could see coming. Constantine's government inherited the Anatolian campaign and faced an immediate choice: withdraw from Anatolia, acknowledging the failure of the entire enterprise and abandoning the Greek populations of the region to whatever Kemal's nationalist government intended for them, or press forward, without the Allied support that the campaign required, against an enemy that was rebuilding its military capacity with the time and resources that Greek political paralysis was providing. They pressed forward. The Greek army launched a major offensive in the spring and summer of 1921. The drive toward Ankara, covered in the previous video in this series, that came within 40 miles of Kemal's capital and could not take it. The Battle of Sakarya, 22 days. The Greek army's last real offensive capability consumed against Turkish defenses that held because they had to. After Sakarya, the strategic situation was what Venizelos had known it would be from the moment the election results came in. The army could not advance. It could not negotiate from a position of strength. It could not withdraw without abandoning the Greek populations of Anatolia. It sat on its lines and grew weaker while Kemal's army grew stronger. In May 1922, Constantine's government appointed General Hatzianestis, the glass general, the man who believed his legs were made of glass, to command the army. In August 1922, Kemal launched his great offensive. In 3 weeks, everything collapsed. The Greek army that Venizelos had built, and that had won the Balkan Wars and fought on the Macedonian front, and advanced to within 40 miles of Ankara, was destroyed as an organized fighting force in 21 days. Smyrna burned in September 1922. 1.5 million Greeks were expelled from Anatolia under the population exchange mandated by the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. Eastern Thrace, the territory Venizelos had secured at Paris, the territory that put Greece within reach of Constantinople, was returned to Turkey under the same treaty. The Megali idea died in 1922. Not on the battlefield, the Greek soldier had fought well enough. It died in a voting booth in November 1920 when a people exhausted by 8 years of war chose the promise of peace over the reality of what peace would actually cost. Constantine abdicated again in September 1922 as the military catastrophe became clear. He died in exile in January 1923, before the Treaty of Lausanne was signed, before the full dimensions of what his return had cost were formally acknowledged in international law. Venizelos returned to Greek politics in the 1920s and again in the early 1930s. He negotiated with Ataturk, the man whose military success had destroyed everything Venizelos built at Paris, and reached a genuine accommodation between Greece and Turkey that made the two countries neighbors rather than enemies. He died in Paris in March 1936. He is buried in Crete, the island where he was born, on August 23, 1864, the island that was still part of the Ottoman Empire when he came into the world, and that had been part of Greece for 23 years when he left it. The territorial Greece that exists today, the borders on every modern map, is substantially the Greece that Venizelos created. Thessaloniki is Greek because of the army he built and the diplomacy he conducted. The Aegean Islands are Greek because of what he negotiated at Paris. The northern borders of modern Greece reflect the Balkan Wars settlements that his political and military work made possible. What is not on the map? What should be on the map? What was on the map that Venizelos carried out of Paris in 1919? Is Eastern Thrace, up to Constantinople, the Smyrna zone, the Aegean coast of Anatolia, where Greeks had been living for 3,000 years. That map existed. It was agreed. It was written into a peace treaty. It died in a voting booth. The men who fought in the Greek army in Anatolia, the soldiers who held the line at Sakarya and retreated through the burning streets of Smyrna, came home to a Greece that was trying to absorb the consequences of what the November 1920 election had set in motion. They came home to a country that was simultaneously trying to absorb 1.5 million refugees from Anatolia and process the failure of the greatest national ambition in its modern history. Most of them did not talk about it. The generation that fought in the Balkan Wars and the First World War and the Greco-Turkish War, that spent essentially their entire adult lives in uniform, fighting for a Greece that was supposed to be bigger than the one they came home to, largely kept their own counsel about what they had experienced and what it meant. Their children and grandchildren carry it differently. Venizelos' birthday on August 23rd is widely commemorated across Greece, particularly in his native Crete, where celebrations reflect the depth of feeling that island has always carried for its most famous son. It is not a formal national holiday. Greece's two great national holidays are March 25th and October 28th, but the commemorations speak to something that official holidays cannot always capture: the voluntary remembrance of a people who understand what they owe to one man. The modern Greek state acknowledges what he built in a way that the 1920 electorate did not. His face appears on monuments in cities across the country. The airport in Athens was named after him for decades, but acknowledgement is not the same as having it. The Greece that Venizelos built at Paris in 1919, the Greece that should have existed, that was agreed to by the most powerful nations on earth, that was weeks away from being implemented when the election intervened, that Greece never happened. What happened instead is the Greece that exists today, which is a remarkable country with a remarkable history that has survived things that would have destroyed less resilient nations. But it is not the Greece that was possible in 1919. It is not the Greece that Venizelos walked out of Paris carrying in a treaty. The difference between those two Greeces, the one that existed and the one that was possible, is measured in the 1.5 million people expelled from Anatolia, in the burning of Smyrna, in the end of 3,000 years of Greek civilization on the Aegean coast of Asia Minor. And at the center of that difference is an election, one vote. One November morning in 1920, when a people who had been fighting for 8 years decided they were tired. They were right to be tired. 8 years of war is a reasonable thing to be tired of. The exhaustion was real, and the desire for peace was human and understandable, and not something that history should judge harshly. But the consequences were what they were. And the man who understood those consequences more clearly than anyone, who knew on the night of November 14th, 1920, exactly what the vote meant and exactly what would follow from it, boarded a ship the next morning and sailed into exile, carrying with him the knowledge of what Greece had been about to become. Eleftherios Venizelos spent the rest of his life trying to salvage what he could from what the election had destroyed. He largely succeeded in building a stable peace between Greece and Turkey, an achievement that required accepting the loss of everything he had won at Paris, which is a specific kind of political courage that history does not always recognize. He died as he had lived, working, thinking, trying to make the best available outcome from whatever situation presented itself. The Cretan boy who had grown up in an island that was not yet part of Greece, who had spent his life expanding what Greece was and what it could be, died in Paris, the city where he had achieved his greatest triumph and from which he had watched it be dismantled by a vote. The story of what Greece was about to win and what one election cost it is not taught the way it should be. It deserves to be told as what it is, one of the most devastating political tragedies in the history of any democracy. A story about vision and exhaustion and the gap between what leaders can achieve and what peoples can sustain. A story whose consequences are still visible on every map of the Eastern Mediterranean. The documents exist. The treaty exists. The conference records exist. The private correspondence of the men who were there, who watched Venizelos work in Paris and knew what he was building, exists in archives in London and Paris and Athens. The story just needed someone to tell it. If you felt the weight of this story, that's history doing what it's supposed to do. That like button honors that feeling. Don't skip it. We carry these stories carefully. Every fact verified, every name checked, every detail earned. If that standard matters to you, subscribe and help us maintain it. Where are you watching from? Drop your country below and tell us, does your family carry the memory of what Greece lost in 1922, of what was possible and what happened instead? Tell us in the comments. Thank you for carrying the weight of Venizelos' story forward. He carried something heavier, the knowledge of what was possible and the responsibility of what was lost. The least we can do is remember it.